Welcome to our presentation on women in education policy. Educating people in the United States is expensive and costs taxpayers a lot of money each year. So the question is, why do we invest in educating anyone? It is widely accepted that education is essential for individual success as well as success of society as a whole. Education in the United States serves the following three functions. First, economic. Education prepares workers for jobs that will keep the economy strong. Second, civic. We teach children civic values that help democracy function and carry democratic values from generation to generation. And finally, social, because education is the primary means for social mobility. When educational resources were scarce, women were only educated through elementary school. This would give them just enough education to help them perform their duties in the household and raise their sons to understand democratic ideals and civic responsibility. It was also widely believed that the female brain was smaller than the male brain, and women did not have the capacity to handle the same level of education as males. When the cost of education increased, schools could not afford to recruit high school educated men to teach. It was easier and more affordable to train women through secondary school and hire them to become teachers in their communities. It was also believed that giving more education to women would create more well-educated wives for well-educated men. Thus, women educated alongside men, but only prepared for their special separate female roles in society. Leaders of the women's movement challenged the idea that women did not have the same learning capabilities as men and advocated for co-education. After the Civil War, private colleges were established for women with the same curriculum as elite men's colleges. Many women throughout history have advocated for equal education for women. Mary Wollstonecraft was the first English writer to argue that co-education would improve both sexes and society as a whole. Sophia B. Packard and Harriet E. Giles established a school for black females in the South, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony advocated for co-education based on the idea that women and men have the same inalienable rights and the same learning and reasoning capabilities. After the 1960s, women's educational participation declined, and in the 1960s, women made up a smaller percentage in the elite professions than they did in the 1920s. Today, women make up a majority of the population of college students, but are still underrepresented in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics majors. As a result, colleges are making significant efforts to create mentoring programs in college communities that will welcome and retain women in these areas. After the 1960s, several women's organizations were formed, and the beginning of equality among the sexes began. During the 1960s, though, education was not of the utmost importance due to other issues of the time period, like segregation. The education section of the Civil Rights Act banned race but not sex. Title IX, a statute intended to end sex discrimination in education, became law on June 23, 1972. An amendment is proposed to require the Department of Health and Education and Welfare to issue a regulation that offers reasonable provisions given the nature of certain sports on July 1, 1974. 1975, regulations of non-discrimination in education programs become effective. Elementary schools are given 1 year to comply, and secondary schools were given 3 years to comply. In 2000, the Department of Justice issued a common rule to cover educational programs such as police academies and vocational programs for inmates. Finally, in 2006, the U.S. Department of Education repealed regulations prohibiting single-sex classes within coeducational schools and set in place new regulations that ease these requirements. Each of these significant moments in Title IX's history are discussed in more detail later. But first we want to review who is exempt from Title IX and what the overall benefits are. The first exemption is for extracurricular activities, including the Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, and the YMCA and YWCA, that were able to maintain their sex-segregated membership. The second exemption is for textbooks and educational materials that may be gender-biased, but are exempt due to First Amendment rights. Some of the benefits of Title IX is first, under Title IX, physical education classes can no longer be segregated, and with the exception of contact sports and classes teaching human sexuality. Second, the law also applies to educational programs that receive federal funding and to all aspects of the school's education system. Title IX benefits both boys and girls, and it is an example of 40 years of efforts to promote and establish gender equality in schools. In college, the next challenge to overcome was for women to receive an equal share of resources allocated to high school and college athletics.
Legislation that
At the
said
collegiate
we cannot
level,
discriminate
athletics is
against
especially
anybody
tricky. The
based
following
on their
video
sex
contains
in terms of
interviews with
educational
Sun Devil Athletics
opportunities
coaches
in any
and
entity
players
that has federal
talking about the
funding.
impact of Title IX.
My definition of Title IX would be, allowing, boys and girls basically equal opportunities in the education field. And with that, I think you get the extracurricular activities in schools, which is, from our standpoint, is the athletics.
There wasn't any resources, funding really allocated for women's sports prior to Title IX.
But you see, what was happening then is we didn't know any different. And when I did ask the administration why it was that way, the response would be, "Oh, honey, that's just the way it is for women." And my response would be, "I don't think it makes it right."
I never really thought about how much it really impacted everyone and just how much it gave everyone an opportunity to be here.
Seeing what's happened, I think Title IX basically is giving female athletes or females great opportunities in the education and athletic fields, and it's made a big impact, no question about it.
I truly believe the education you get as an athlete through your sport experience is probably almost as valuable as what you're getting in the classroom, because you just truly learn so much as an athlete, especially at the collegiate level.
If it weren't for Title IX, I probably wouldn't be playing women's basketball in high school, let alone in college. And it's just paved the way for female athletes to make a name for themselves and just really flourish in not only sports, but academics as well.
Well, our women's basketball program is having a
As
Title IX
former
celebration of
women's
40 years
golf coach
with their
mentioned,
opening basketball game, and they are going to honor 40 female athletes in the vicinity here that have had an impact with women's sports.
We knew we had a great home opener with Texas Tech because they're a perennial powerhouse, and we've got two, really good teams going head-to-head for the home opener. And so with that, we thought, well, what can we do around that game, because we know there'll be a lot of interest, to do a little something extra. And we're excited. Should be an amazing event, and we're hoping that everybody comes out and sees it.
Feminists argued in the 1970s that men received a disproportional amount of scholarships, coaching and tutoring staff, and facilities from being student athletes than female student athletes. The National Collegiate Athletic Association, or NCAA, saw the state of affairs differently. The NCAA said that if women were more interested, then the sports would have equal funding. The Office of Civil Rights for the Department of Education resolved the seemingly chicken or egg question with 3 conditions, one of which the school must follow. First, the level of sports participation is proportionate to the number of women and men in the student body. This is known as the proportionality test. Second, if the school has a history of expanding opportunities for an underrepresented sex. Or third, if the school is fully and effectively accommodating the interests and abilities of the underrepresented sex, then they are in line with Title IX. In 1994, Congress orders that coeducational colleges and universities need to produce yearly reports on gender equality in their athletics programs. In 1996, Cohen v. Brown University, a federal court ruling, used the third condition of the OCR ruling to decide that Brown University was not in compliance with Title IX, since, quote, cutting 2 women's teams left the interests and abilities of women athletes comparatively less accommodated for than those of men, end quote. This opened the door for men's teams to sue universities for cutting their programs, and Congress recognized the intention of Title IX was not to make fewer opportunities for men. Congress quickly held hearings, and the result was a letter being issued by the OCR indicating the first condition, the proportionality clause, was all that was needed to be in compliance with Title IX. However, in 2002, the National Wrestling Coaches Association sued the Department of Education on the grounds that quotas, or the proportionality clause, discriminated against men because men were more interested in athletics than women. The Department of Education tried to take the middle ground by officially stating that the practice of cutting some sports teams to be in compliance was disfavored and that an interest survey should be developed and implemented to determine who wanted to participate in sports and then set the budgets accordingly. The Education Secretary sent out a clarification recommending that a survey be used instead of the proportionality test to colleges and universities in 2005. The NCAA strongly urged against implementing the interest survey, as did many other Title IX defenders such as the Women's Sports Foundation and National Women's Law Center. Most colleges did not implement the survey, and in April of 2010, President Obama's administration rescinded the clarification. This gives legal precedence back to the proportionality test, or that women and men's sports must be funded at the same proportion of women and men in the entire student body. On June 20, 2012, President Obama introduced Title IX reforms. The first is that the following United States government agencies will be working together to develop best practices: the Department of Justice, Department of Energy, NASA, National Science Foundation, and the Department of Health and Human Services, with the Department of Education leading the initiative. Second, the Department of Education will revise Title IX technical assistance to K-12 and post-secondary institutions to explicitly address STEM inequalities. And finally, they will expand data collection and analysis to track the relevant trends of the gender gap across K-12 education. Before athletics began advocating for gender equality, feminists began supporting the idea of women's studies in public education as early as the 1940s. Gender equality policies focus more on equal access and, for the most part, do not address the content of the education. Over time, this promotion of women's studies became an advocacy for sex education. The Women's Educational Equality Act of 1974 was spanned by this movement. This counterpart to Title IV legislation authorized funding to assist schools to develop non-sexist materials and textbooks, training programs, and guidance and counseling activities. It also provided funding for teacher training and support research. It created the National Advisory Council on Women's Educational Programs. Legislation was also proposed for vocational training. The 1984 Carl D. Perkins Vocational Act required vocational programs to have sex equality coordinators to reduce the sex bias in vocational training. The act required the set-aside of a percentage of a state's federal funding for vocational training aimed at single parents and displaced homemakers. In 1994, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act revitalized WEEA. The act encouraged teacher training to overcome gender bias and how the sexes were treated in the classroom. It promoted more females in math and science and encouraged programs on harassment and abuse. These programs have fallen out of favor. The NAC was dismantled in 1988. WEAA is still part of the Department of Education, but with a very measly budget of $3 million annually. The ESEA has had little attention since 2000, even though the Perkins Act was strengthened in 1990 by increasing the set-aside to eliminate the sex stereotyping in vocation programs. It has been weakened by the elimination in 1998 for a set-aside for displaced homemakers and removing the requirement for a coordinator. However, women's studies have still made an impact without being universally accepted. Single-sex schools were being challenged and were on a steady decline after Title IX legislation. The Supreme Court ruled schools could not be single-sex if another school was not available offering the same type and same quality of education. In 1996, a Supreme Court ruling took the benchmark for allowing same-sex education further. The ruling stated that a state must demonstrate an exceedingly persuasive justification for gender-based programs related to a government objective when same-sex education is allowed. The No Child Left Behind legislation reauthorized the Elementary and Secondary Education Act that allows local educational agencies to use innovative programs funds to support same-gender schools and classroom consistent with applicable law. States such as Florida, Colorado, Michigan, South Carolina, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania have all taken advantage of the opportunity. Advocates for same-sex schools argue that schools are not inferior and graduates to not have inferior jobs. Women benefit from not having to compete with men for sports teams and funding, and women get to maintain a leadership position in the school. Advocates claim that schools free students from gender stereotypes. Opponents against same-sex schools claim that male colleges have a higher prestige, and women cannot develop the assertive skills necessary to be successful in the workforce without male competition. Advocates against same-sex schools claim that gender-specific curriculum and materials reinforce gender stereotypes. 506 public schools in the United States offered single-sex education during the 2011-2012 school year. Of those, 390 of the schools are co-ed schools, which offer single-sex classrooms. All states comply with Title IX legislation to a different degree. However, most power resides with the state or local school boards. There are three types of state laws on sex equality. The first is comprehensive laws that ban sex discrimination in all areas of public institutions. Second, human rights laws, which is like the Public Accommodation Statute and Equal Rights Amendments to the state constitutions that address sex discrimination but without enforcement mechanisms. And finally, no statutes or constitutional provisions have been passed in some states. Thank you so much for watching our presentation. We hope you understand more about the history of gender equality in education in the United States.